This is the Steel Revolution Objective 1 about how the steel industry contributed to the post-Civil War industrial revolution in America. And where we want to start with this, of course, would be the beginnings of the steel industry, how it got started. For the most part, the big boom in steel is going to be after the Civil War. Initially, before the Civil War, steel was a very scarce and very expensive commodity. Prior to the Civil War, most of the buildings that were created really didn't have any steel or, frankly, any iron in them for the most part. Most of them were made mostly with wood and brick, like you see in this house here and in the previous slide. These are kind of the old style houses. I don't know that these houses predate the Civil War, but this would have been the kind of architecture that would have existed prior to the Civil War, where everything was made of brick with just wooden interiors. It's part of the reason that so many buildings in major cities caught fire during the urban revolution of the brief period right before the Civil War and shortly after the Civil War. As people were moving into the cities, fires became very common because all the interiors were just nothing but wood. With the brick there, it just made everything hotter inside, and essentially the brick oven effect would take place. But bottom line here, getting back to the whole idea with steel, steel was very, very scarce and very expensive prior to the Civil War. You might occasionally see some iron on the railroads, and that would really be about it. But when Cornelius Vanderbilt even started building his railroads, he imported steel from Great Britain. That's how scarce it was in the United States. The steel could hold a heavier load than the iron could, but nobody was really producing steel over here, so Vanderbilt spent a lot of extra money to import steel for his rails as he got his industry started. Most railroaders were not doing the same thing. They were just using good old-fashioned American steel, or American iron, I'm sorry, but steel was just a much better product. But over here, since nobody was really producing it and it was so scarce, steel was basically used for this, silverware. Outside of silverware, the occasional support beam, things like that, it really was not a widely held or widely used commodity. Now, what actually revolutionized the steel industry was something called the Bessemer process, which was essentially invented in 1855. Basically, what it did was create a lot more steel at a faster rate. This is a picture here of the Bessemer converter. Now, the man who is responsible for this is British inventor Henry Bessemer, who came up with the concept in the first place. Now, after Bessemer had perfected the process, this man, William Kelly, was the one who brought it to the United States. So the question is, of course, what is the Bessemer process? Well, the first thing you need to make the Bessemer process work is a Bessemer converter. And this is a picture of a modern-day Bessemer converter right here. It's kind of a big hulking piece of equipment, and the basic idea behind the Bessemer converter is that you're going to have a lot of melted or molten iron down the bottom of the converter right here. Cold air is going to come in through here, and that cold air blowing on the red hot iron is going to ignite the carbon that is in the melted iron here. Once the cold air basically ignites the carbon is going to escape through the top of this converter right here, and by removing the carbon, you get a stronger element. This is a cross-section of a Bessemer converter right here. On this side, of course, you see the external view. Over here, you see the melted iron, which eventually is going to be steel as it gets poured out. But the cold air comes in, and then as the carbon gets ignited and turns into steam or into gas, it removes out of the top. The carbon monoxide comes out of the top of the thing like this. Now the result is iron without the impurities. And with the impurities gone, it's a much stronger, much denser element. In other words, steel. So molten iron with the carbon taken out is the Bessemer process, and it's the process of creating steel. Now over here, when William Kelly first showed up with the idea, most people thought it was pretty crazy, except for a young guy named Andrew Carnegie. More on him a little bit later. Now in the first 20 years of after the Civil War, the steel industry is really going to take off. Everything from shovels to railroads was made of steel. Bridges were made of steel. Skyscrapers started to exchange out their wooden frames for steel frames, and as new skyscrapers were being built and became more popular in cities, it was steel that became a part of their structure. So the market for steel after the Civil War went through the roof. We already know how big the railroad age was and how Vanderbilt was importing steel from Great Britain. Well, once people found out that it could carry a much heavier load than iron could because it was denser and stronger without the carbon impurities in it, everybody wanted steel for their railroads. Everybody wanted steel for their trains. Everybody wanted steel for their bridges because it could support more weight. And of course, in the new age of urban society, as people kept moving into the cities in the late 1800s, everybody wanted it for their new skyscrapers. By the time we got to the 1800s, mid-1800s, America was producing 1/3 of the world's steel as the revolution continued on. It was a hard business, it was a tough business, but it was also a very lucrative business. And those involved in steel started to do really, really well for themselves. In fact, by the time we actually reached the turn of the century in 1900, America passes Britain and Germany, who had been the traditional worldwide leaders in steel production. By 1900, America was producing more than Britain and Germany combined. So from the Civil War to 1900, because of all the factors we've already talked about, the steel industry just grows by tremendous leaps and bounds. Okay, that's it on Objective 1. The next one will be about the leader of the steel industry in America, a guy named Andrew Carnegie.